We're exploring the topic of what getting high was like in medieval times this evening. Without further ado, let's get this story. The medieval world was a place of shadows and firelight, of stone walls and thatched roofs, where the line between medicine and magic blurred like smoke from a brazier, and where the pursuit of altered consciousness took forms that would seem both familiar and utterly foreign to us today. In those times when life was often brutal and short, when the church held sway over souls and lords over bodies, people still sought ways to escape the grinding reality of their daily existence, to touch something beyond the mundane, to feel something more than the ache of labor and the weight of survival. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town on a feast day, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and spilled ale, and you might catch, if you knew what to look for, the sweet scent of hemp burning somewhere in the shadows between buildings. Cannabis, which we now associate with modern culture, was actually well known throughout medieval Europe, though not always for the reasons we might expect. It grew wild in many places, cultivated in monastery gardens alongside other medicinal herbs, its fibers woven into rope and cloth, its seeds pressed for oil, and yes, its leaves and flowers sometimes burned or consumed for their peculiar effects on the mind. The knowledge of hemp's psychoactive properties wasn't hidden or forbidden in the way we might imagine. Medieval herbalists wrote about it quite openly in their manuscripts, though they spoke of it in terms of humors and vapors, of hot and cold qualities, of its ability to affect the brain's moisture. They called it by many names depending on the region and language: cannabis, hemp, ganja in the East, where traders brought tales of its use, and each culture that encountered it seemed to develop its own relationship with this curious plant. But cannabis was far from the only means by which medieval people altered their consciousness. The most common and socially acceptable intoxicant was, of course, alcohol, but even this took forms quite different from what we know today. Ale and beer were dietary staples, drunk by everyone from children to the elderly, often safer than water and considered necessary for health and strength. The ale of medieval times was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than the clear beers we know, and it was consumed throughout the day in quantities that would astound us. Workers might drink several pints during their labor, considering it fuel rather than intoxication, though surely the line between sustenance and stupor was often crossed. Wine held a different place in the medieval imagination, associated with the blood of Christ, with nobility and refinement, with the warm lands of the South where grapes grew heavy on the vine. The wealthy might drink wines spiced with exotic ingredients brought from distant lands: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, ginger, creating potent mixtures that were believed to have medicinal properties. These spiced wines, called hippocras after the ancient physician Hippocrates, were thought to balance the body's humors, to warm cold constituents, to cure melancholy and inspire joy. Then there was mead, that ancient drink of fermented honey that carried with it associations of the old gods, of warriors and poets, of wedding nights and victory celebrations. Medieval people believed mead had special properties, that it could inspire poetry and prophecy, that it could inflame a passion and courage. The production of mead was often surrounded by ritual and tradition. The honey gathered at specific times. The fermentation began under certain phases of the moon. Prayers and charms spoken over the brewing vessels. But the medieval quest for altered states went far beyond these familiar intoxicants. In the shadows of society, in the hidden corners of markets and the secret knowledge of wise women and cunning men, there existed a whole pharmacopoeia of mind-altering substances that would make even modern heads spin. Consider the ergot fungus that grew on rye grain, particularly in damp years, which could cause whole villages to experience collective visions, dancing manias, and strange afflictions that were often attributed to curses or divine punishment. Some scholars now believe that many cases of supposed witchcraft and possession were actually incidents of ergot poisoning, entire communities accidentally consuming this powerful hallucinogen in their daily bread. The symptoms of ergotism, as we now call it, were terrifying and spectacular. People would feel burning sensations in their limbs, as if fire was consuming them from within, leading to the condition being called Saint Anthony's fire, after the saint whose intercession was sought for relief. Victims might experience powerful hallucinations, seeing demons and angels, feeling as if they could fly or were being pulled into the earth. Some would dance uncontrollably for days, unable to stop until they collapsed from exhaustion, creating the dancing plagues that swept through European towns like strange, ecstatic epidemics. Yet not all psychoactive substances were consumed accidentally. Medieval physicians and herbalists had extensive knowledge of plants that could affect the mind, and they used them deliberately, though within a framework of understanding very different from our own. Mandrake root, with its humanoid shape and powerful alkaloids, was surrounded by legend and lore. It was said that the plant would scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. So elaborate rituals were developed for its harvest, using dogs to pull it up, or digging around it while blocking one's ears with wax. The root was used in surgical preparations, mixed with wine or vinegar to create a primitive anesthetic that would render patients insensible to pain. Though the line between unconsciousness and death was perilously thin. Henbane, another powerful plant in the medieval pharmacist's arsenal, was known to cause vivid hallucinations and a sensation of flying. It was sometimes burned in public bathhouses, its smoke creating a communal intoxication that must have made for quite extraordinary social experiences. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit bathhouse, the air thick with steam and smoke, feeling the gentle dissociation beginning as the henbane smoke entered your lungs. The boundaries between self and other beginning to blur in the warm water and dim light. The preparation of these substances was often elaborate and ritualistic. Flying ointments, those mysterious preparations supposedly used by witches to achieve their nighttime flights to Sabbaths, were real compounds documented in various medieval and Renaissance texts. These ointments typically contained a mixture of psychoactive plants, belladonna, henbane, mandrake, datura, mixed with animal fat to aid absorption through the skin. When applied to sensitive areas of the body, particularly mucous membranes, these ointments could indeed produce powerful sensations of flying, of transformation, of leaving the body behind. The recipes for these preparations were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations of healers, midwives, and others who worked with the mysteries of the body and mind. A typical flying ointment might be prepared under specific astrological conditions, with prayers or incantations spoken at each stage of the process. The fat of unbaptized infants was supposedly preferred, though in reality, practitioners likely used whatever animal fats were available, the scandalous ingredients being more about creating an aura of forbidden power than actual necessity. The experience of using such preparations must have been profound and often terrifying. Users reported sensations of their skin growing fur or feathers, of their bodies stretching and transforming, of flying through the night sky to distant places where they would meet with others who had made similar journeys. Whether these were purely hallucinations, or whether there was some shared cultural script that shaped the experiences, the consistency of the reports across different regions and time periods is striking. The medieval world also had its own version of what we might call psychedelic tourism. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites might seek out special experiences along the way, visiting hermits known for their visions, seeking out holy wells whose waters were said to grant prophetic dreams, or consuming special preparations offered by monasteries that might help them achieve religious ecstasy. The line between spiritual experience and chemical alteration was not drawn as we draw it today. Indeed, many medieval thinkers would have seen no contradiction between the two. Monasteries themselves were centers of experimentation with consciousness-altering substances. Monks, with their literacy, their gardens, and their dedication to exploring the divine, were often at the forefront of herbal medicine. They grew poppies for pain relief, developing techniques for extracting opium that would be used to ease the suffering of the sick and dying. They experimented with different preparations of herbs and flowers, seeking combinations that might aid in meditation, in staying awake for lengthy vigils, or in achieving the mystical union with God that was the goal of contemplative practice. The medieval understanding of how these substances worked was, of course, very different from our modern pharmacological knowledge. They spoke of vapors rising to the brain, of hot and cold, wet and dry qualities that needed to be balanced. A person of melancholic temperament, cold and dry, might be prescribed warming, moistening substances to restore balance. Someone of choleric disposition, hot and dry, would need cooling, moistening remedies. This system of humoral medicine created a complex framework for understanding both physical and mental effects of various substances. The social context of intoxication in medieval times was also remarkably different from our own. Communal drinking was not just accepted but expected, with elaborate rituals and customs governing how alcohol was consumed. The loving cup passed from person to person at feasts, each drinker making a toast to their companion's health. The wassail bowl at Christmas time, filled with spiced ale or cider, carried from house to house in a ritual of community bonding. These were not just occasions for getting drunk, though that certainly happened, but complex social rituals that reinforced bonds of loyalty, friendship, and hierarchy. Even excessive intoxication was viewed through a different lens than we use today. While drunkenness was certainly condemned by the church as the sin of gluttony, it was also often seen as a temporary madness, a possession by spirits, hence spirits as a term for alcohol, or a necessary release valve for the pressures of medieval life. Feast days and festivals were expected to involve a certain amount of excess, a temporary inversion of the normal order where peasants might mock their lords, where fools were crowned as kings, where the usual rules of behavior were suspended. The tavern and the alehouse were central to medieval social life, serving not just as places to drink, but as community centers, informal courts, and information exchanges. Here, over cups of ale or wine, deals were struck, marriages arranged, disputes settled. The alewife, often a widow supporting herself by brewing and selling beer, was a common figure in medieval communities, her house marked by an ale stake, a pole with a bush or sign attached that indicated fresh brew was available. The quality and strength of medieval alcoholic beverages varied wildly. While the everyday ale might be relatively weak, special brews for festivals could be potent indeed. Double or triple strength ales were brewed for special occasions, and these could quickly reduce even experienced drinkers to stumbling incoherence. Distillation, while known in the medieval period primarily for creating medicines and perfumes, was beginning to be applied to alcohol by the later Middle Ages, creating aqua vita, the water of life, which would eventually evolve into various spirits and liqueurs. The medieval period also saw the use of various plants and herbs added to alcoholic beverages specifically for their psychoactive effects. Wormwood, the key ingredient in what would later become absinthe, was commonly added to wines and ales. Brut, a mixture of herbs used to flavor and preserve beer before hops became common, often contained psychoactive plants like wild rosemary, yarrow, and bog myrtle. These additions could significantly alter the effects of the alcohol, creating experiences that went beyond simple drunkenness. The intersection of medicine and intoxication in medieval times was particularly complex. Many medical treatments involved the administration of powerful psychoactive substances, and the line between treatment and recreational use was often blurred. A person suffering from melancholy might be prescribed wine infused with borage flowers, which were believed to bring courage and joy. Someone with persistent pain might receive preparations of poppy or hemlock, carefully measured to bring relief without causing death. These medical uses created a certain familiarity with altered states that permeated medieval society. The concept of dosage in medieval times was far less precise than what we understand today. Recipes might call for as much as will lie on a penny or 7 leaves of the medium size, measurements that left much room for variation and, occasionally, dangerous miscalculation. The strength of herbal preparations could vary wildly depending on growing conditions, harvest time, storage methods, and preparation techniques. What might be a mild sedative in one batch could be a powerful hallucinogen or deadly poison in another. This uncertainty added an element of risk to all medieval drug use that we can barely imagine today. Every cup of herbal tea, every medicinal tincture, every bit of preserved food potentially carried the risk of unexpected psychoactive effects. The wise woman preparing a remedy had to rely on experience, intuition, and careful observation to judge the potency of her preparations. Users had to trust in the skill of the preparer and the providence of God to protect them from harm. The role of women in medieval psychoactive substance use is particularly interesting and complex. Women were often the keepers of herbal knowledge, the brewers of ale, the midwives who knew which plants could ease the pains of childbirth or prevent conception. This knowledge gave them a certain power that was both respected and feared. The image of the witch with her cauldron, brewing strange potions, is not entirely fantasy. Women did indeed brew and prepare various psychoactive substances, though usually for healing rather than harm. The accusations of witchcraft that swept through Europe in the later medieval and early modern periods often centered on the use of psychoactive substances. Witches were said to use ointments and potions to transform themselves and others, to cause madness or love to fly to their sabbaths. While these accusations were largely fabricated or exaggerated, they did reflect a real anxiety about the power of those who understood how to alter consciousness through chemical means. The medieval world also had its own drug trades and smuggling operations, though they looked quite different from modern trafficking. Spices, many of which had mild psychoactive properties, were worth their weight in gold and were transported across vast distances through complex trading networks. Opium from the East, various exotic herbs and resins, preparations known only to certain cultures or regions, all of these moved along the same routes as silk and silver, carried by merchants who might not fully understand the uses of their wares. Venice, that great trading city, was particularly important in the medieval drug trade. Venetian merchants had access to the markets of the East, bringing back not just spices and silks, but also knowledge of Eastern medicine and consciousness-altering practices. The Venetian treacle, or theriac, a complex preparation containing dozens of ingredients, including opium, was famous throughout Europe as a cure-all and was certainly psychoactive in its effects. The Crusades, for all their violence and religious fervor, also served as a conduit for psychoactive knowledge between East and West. Crusaders encountered hashish in the Middle East, learning about its use from both Islamic physicians and, according to legend, from the assassins, that mysterious sect whose name became linked with the drug. Whether the stories of hashish-fueled assassination cults were true or not, the returning Crusaders certainly brought back knowledge of cannabis preparations that had not been common in Europe. Islamic culture, with its prohibition on alcohol, had developed a sophisticated understanding of other consciousness-altering substances. Medieval Islamic physicians and scholars wrote extensively about the properties of various drugs, their medical uses, and their effects on the mind. This knowledge gradually filtered into European understanding through translations of Arabic texts and through the cultural exchange that occurred in places like Spain, where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish cultures mingled. The medieval Jewish communities also played an important role in the preservation and transmission of psychoactive knowledge. Jewish physicians who could move relatively freely between Christian and Islamic worlds often served as conduits for medical knowledge, including information about consciousness-altering substances. The famous medieval Jewish physician Maimonides wrote about the use of various psychoactive plants, attempting to reconcile their use with religious law and medical necessity. The regulation of psychoactive substances in medieval times was sporadic and often more concerned with economic than health or moral considerations. Guilds might regulate the brewing of ale to ensure quality and prevent competition, but there was little attempt to control consumption itself. The Church condemned excess, but generally accepted moderate use of alcohol and even some other substances when used medicinally. It was only when use was associated with heresy, witchcraft, or other threats to the social order that authorities took serious action. The medieval festival calendar provided numerous opportunities for sanctioned intoxication. The 12 days of Christmas, Carnival before Lent, May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, all of these involved drinking, feasting, and often the use of other consciousness-altering substances. These periods of license served as safety valves for social tensions, times when the normal rules could be bent or broken without threatening the overall structure of society. During Carnival, for instance, the world was temporarily turned upside down. Mock kings were crowned, gender roles might be reversed with men dressing as women and women as men, and general mayhem was not just tolerated but expected. The consumption of large quantities of alcohol and other substances was part of this temporary chaos, a way of stepping outside the normal boundaries of consciousness, just as the festival stepped outside the normal boundaries of social order. The May Day celebrations often involved the gathering of flowers and herbs, some of which had psychoactive properties. Young people would go a-maying, spending the night in the forests gathering greenery and, according to disapproving churchmen, engaging in various forms of licentious behavior. The flowers and herbs gathered would be used to decorate homes and churches, but some would also be used to make special drinks and preparations associated with fertility and love. The concept of love potions deserves special attention in any discussion of medieval psychoactive substances. These preparations, which might contain anything from relatively harmless herbs like vervain and rose petals to more dangerous plants like datura or henbane, were intended to inspire passion and desire. The belief in their efficacy was widespread, and their use was common enough that church authorities regularly condemned them. Whether they actually worked to inspire love is debatable, but they certainly could produce altered states that might be interpreted as passion or enchantment. The medieval understanding of the relationship between body and soul, matter and spirit, made the use of psychoactive substances a theological as well as medical issue. If the soul was trapped in the body, might certain substances help free it temporarily? If divine visions could come through fasting and prayer, might they also come through the use of certain plants that God had provided? These questions were debated by theologians and philosophers, though usually in abstract terms rather than direct discussion of drug use. Some mystics and visionaries may have used psychoactive substances to aid in their spiritual experiences, though this is difficult to prove definitively. The visions of Hildegard of Bingen, with their complex geometric patterns and brilliant colors, have been compared to psychedelic experiences, though they might equally be explained by migraines or purely spiritual experiences. The ecstasies of other medieval mystics, the detailed visions of heaven and hell, the experiences of divine union, all of these might have been purely spiritual, or they might have been aided by fasting, sleep deprivation, and possibly the use of consciousness-altering substances. The medieval practice of using incense in religious ceremonies certainly had psychoactive components. The frankincense and myrrh burned in churches contain compounds that can produce mild alterations in consciousness, particularly in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation. The thick clouds of incense smoke, combined with the sensory overload of medieval religious ceremonies, the chanting, the bells, the flickering candles, the glorious colors of stained glass, created an environment conducive to altered states of consciousness. The architecture of medieval churches was itself designed to produce altered states of consciousness. The soaring heights of Gothic cathedrals, the play of light through stained glass, the acoustic properties that made chants seem to come from heaven itself. All of these work together to transport the worshiper out of ordinary consciousness and into a state of religious awe. When combined with fasting, sleep deprivation from vigils, and possibly the subtle effects of incense and other substances, the medieval church service could be a powerfully consciousness-altering experience. The use of psychoactive substances in medieval warfare is another fascinating aspect of this history. Vikings were said to consume mushrooms or other preparations before battle to achieve the berserker state, though the exact nature of these substances is debated. Medieval soldiers certainly drank heavily before and after battles, using alcohol to calm nerves before combat and to celebrate or forget afterward. Some armies provided their soldiers with special preparations designed to increase courage and decrease sensitivity to pain. The medieval tournament, that stylized form of combat, was often accompanied by heavy drinking and possibly the use of other substances. Knights preparing for the joust might consume special preparations designed to steady their nerves and sharpen their reflexes, though distinguishing between genuine psychoactive effects and placebo in these cases is impossible. The pageantry and ritual surrounding tournaments, combined with the very real danger of injury or death, created a heightened state of consciousness that substances might enhance but did not create. Medieval sailors and travelers had their own relationship with psychoactive substances. Long sea voyages required stores of ale or wine, as water would quickly go bad in barrels. Sailors developed a culture of drinking that helped them cope with the hardships and terrors of sea travel. They also encountered new substances in foreign ports, bringing back tales of strange plants and preparations that could produce wonderful or terrible effects. The spice trade that drove so much of medieval commerce was partly motivated by the psychoactive properties of many spices. Nutmeg, in large doses, is a powerful hallucinogen, though also potentially dangerous. Cloves have mild euphoric properties. Black pepper was believed to have various effects on consciousness and mood. The enormous prices commanded by these spices reflect not just their rarity and use in food preservation, but also their valued psychoactive properties. The medieval bathhouse was another site of consciousness alteration. These establishments, which served as social centers as well as places for hygiene, often featured steam rooms where various herbs might be thrown on hot stones to create psychoactive smoke. The combination of heat, steam, and herbal smoke could produce profound alterations in consciousness. Some bathhouses were known for particular preparations or techniques, becoming destinations for those seeking specific experiences. The gradual closure of public bathhouses in the later medieval period, driven partly by concerns about morality and disease, represented a significant change in how people could legally and socially achieve altered states. The bathhouse had provided a communal, regulated environment for these experiences. Without them, the use of psychoactive substances was driven further into private and sometimes illicit contexts. The medieval understanding of dreams and their relationship to psychoactive substances is particularly interesting. Dreams were taken very seriously as potential sources of divine revelation, prophecy, or communication with the dead. Various substances were known to affect dreaming, and there was a whole tradition of dream incubation using specific plants and preparations. A person seeking the prophetic dream might fast, pray, and consume certain herbs before sleeping in a holy place, hoping for a vision that would guide their future actions. Mugwort was particularly associated with dreams, often placed under pillows or burned before sleep to promote vivid and prophetic dreams. Other plants like vervain, jasmine, and rose were also used in dream work. The boundary between the waking visions produced by psychoactive plants and the visions that came in dreams was not always clear, and both were seen as potential sources of important information about the future or the divine will. The medieval practice of medicine often required the practitioner to taste or test substances on themselves before administering them to patients. This meant that physicians and herbalists had personal experience with the effects of many psychoactive substances. They developed an experiential understanding that complemented their theoretical knowledge, though this practice also led to numerous cases of accidental poisoning and death among medical practitioners. The doctrine of signatures, the belief that plants resembled the parts of the body they were meant to treat, influenced how psychoactive plants were used. Plants with brain-like appearances, such as walnuts, were used for mental ailments. The mandrake root, with its humanoid form, was believed to affect the entire human system. This symbolic thinking created a rich, if not always accurate, framework for understanding psychoactive effects. Medieval alchemy, that mysterious pursuit that sat somewhere between science and magic, involved extensive experimentation with consciousness-altering substances. Alchemists seeking the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life worked with mercury, antimony, and various plant preparations that could produce powerful psychological effects. The laboratory of an alchemist was a dangerous place, filled with fumes and vapors that could alter consciousness whether intentionally or accidentally. Some alchemical texts describe procedures that seem designed as much to alter the consciousness of the alchemist as to transform base metals into gold. Long periods of watching flames, exposure to various fumes, the consumption of special preparations, these practices created conditions conducive to visions and altered states that were interpreted as spiritual progress or divine revelation. The famous alchemist's quest for transformation was both external and internal, material and spiritual. The medieval fair or market was another context where consciousness-altering substances were encountered. Traveling merchants sold mysterious preparations. Fortune tellers offered potions. Performers and entertainers might share strange smokes or drinks with their audiences. These gatherings were opportunities for people to encounter substances and practices from distant places, to experiment with new forms of intoxication or consciousness alteration. The regulation of these markets was primarily concerned with preventing fraud, rather than controlling psychoactive substances per se. Authorities might test the quality of ale or wine being sold, ensure that weights and measures were accurate, or investigate claims of poisoning, but there was little attempt to control what substances were available. The exception was during times of social unrest or epidemic disease, when authorities might ban gatherings or restrict the sale of certain items believed to spread illness or discord. Medieval students and scholars had their own culture of intoxication. University towns were notorious for the drinking and carousing of students, who were often young men away from home for the first time with access to money and freedom. Tavern songs and drinking songs from medieval universities have survived, celebrating the joys of wine and companionship. Some scholars also experimented with substances believed to enhance memory or intellectual capacity, seeking chemical aids to learning in addition to their studies. The preservation and transmission of knowledge about psychoactive substances relied heavily on oral tradition in addition to written texts. Wise women passed their knowledge to daughters or apprentices through hands-on teaching and memorized recipes. Brewers taught their craft through demonstration and practice. This oral tradition preserved knowledge that might not be written down, either because it was considered too dangerous, too common to need recording, or too associated with illicit or marginal practices. The medieval response to what we would now call addiction was complex and varied. Habitual drunkenness was recognized as a problem and might be addressed through religious penance, medical treatment, or social pressure. The idea of physical dependence on a substance was not well understood, but the behavioral patterns of what we would call addiction were certainly observed. Treatments might involve gradual reduction of the substance, substitution with other substances, or religious intervention such as pilgrimage or entering a monastery. The economic impact of psychoactive substances in medieval society was significant. The brewing industry employed thousands, from farmers growing grain and hops to brewers and tavern keepers. The wine trade connected northern and southern Europe, creating wealth and cultural exchange. The spice trade drove exploration and colonization. Even illicit or semi-illicit substances created economic networks, supporting herbalists, wise women, and various marginal figures who supplied substances the official economy might not acknowledge. The gendering of different forms of intoxication in medieval society reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Wine was often associated with masculinity and the upper classes, while ale was seen as a drink for women and the common people. Certain psychoactive plants were associated with women's medicine, those used in childbirth, for example, while others were the province of male physicians or scholars. These associations were not absolute, but created general patterns that influenced how different substances were perceived and used. The medieval carnival tradition deserves further exploration in the context of consciousness alteration. These events were not just times of increased drinking, but involved elaborate rituals of inversion and transformation. Masks and costumes allowed people to become someone else temporarily. Special foods and drinks consumed only during carnival might contain psychoactive ingredients. The entire atmosphere of carnival, the music, the crowds, the temporary suspension of normal rules, created a collective altered state that individual intoxication enhanced and was enhanced by. The role of music and dance in medieval consciousness alteration cannot be overlooked. The repetitive rhythms of medieval dance music, the circular dances that could continue for hours, the overwhelming sound of bells and drums during festivals, all of these could produce trance-like states. When combined with alcohol or other substances, these activities could create powerful experiences of collective ecstasy. The dancing manias that periodically swept through medieval Europe might have involved not just ergot poisoning, but also the deliberate use of music and movement to achieve altered states. The medieval pilgrimage tradition created unique opportunities for consciousness alteration. Pilgrims might encounter new substances as they traveled, experiment with local traditions, or use psychoactive aids to enhance their spiritual experiences. Some pilgrimage sites were associated with particular substances or preparations, healing waters that might contain psychoactive minerals, herbs gathered from holy sites believed to have special properties, or preparations offered by monks or hermits along the pilgrimage routes. The extreme physical conditions of pilgrimage, long walks, fasting, exposure to the elements, could themselves produce altered states of consciousness. When combined with the emotional intensity of religious devotion and possibly the use of psychoactive substances, pilgrimage could become a profoundly transformative experience. The visions and miracles reported at pilgrimage sites might sometimes have been facilitated by these various forms of consciousness alteration. Medieval warfare and psychoactive substances had a complex relationship beyond just the use of alcohol for courage. Surgeons treating wounded soldiers relied heavily on opium and other pain-relieving substances. The treatment of battle trauma, both physical and psychological, often involved the use of sedatives and other psychoactive preparations. Veterans returning from wars might have developed dependencies on substances used to treat their wounds, creating a medieval equivalent to modern concerns about veteran substance use. The development of gunpowder warfare in the later medieval period created new contexts for substance use. The noise, smoke, and chaos of gunpowder battles were even more overwhelming than traditional combat. Soldiers might use stronger preparations to deal with these new terrors. The sulfurous smoke of gunpowder itself might have had mild psychoactive effects, adding to the disorientation of battle. The medieval understanding of poison was intimately connected with psychoactive substances. Many plants could be medicine in small doses, psychoactive in moderate doses, and poison in large doses. The same preparation that might cure melancholy could cause madness or death if improperly administered. This ambiguity created anxiety about poisoning that runs through medieval literature and historical records. Every cup of wine at a noble feast, every gift of preserved fruits, every medicinal preparation could potentially contain substances intended to alter consciousness or end life. The testing of food and drink for poison, common in noble households, was as much about detecting psychoactive substances as lethal ones. A lord might be as concerned about substances that could cloud his judgment or make him susceptible to manipulation as about those that could kill him. The position of food taster was thus not just about preventing assassination, but about protecting against all forms of chemical influence. Medieval cosmology and its relationship to psychoactive substances presents fascinating connections. The planets and stars were believed to influence both the growth of plants and the humors of the human body. Certain substances were associated with particular planets, opium with the moon, for instance, or wines with the sun. The timing of harvesting, preparation, and consumption of psychoactive substances might be determined by astrological considerations. A remedy prepared under the wrong planetary influences might be ineffective or even harmful, while the same ingredients prepared at the astrologically correct time could be powerful medicine. This astrological framework provided a sophisticated, if scientifically, incorrect model for understanding why the same substance might have different effects at different times or on different people. A person of Saturnine temperament might react differently to a substance than someone of jovial disposition. The phases of the moon might influence the potency of herbal preparations. These beliefs created a complex system that practitioners had to navigate when preparing and administering psychoactive substances. The medieval feast deserves special attention as a site of consciousness alteration. These elaborate events could last for days, involving not just eating and drinking, but also performances, music, dancing, and various entertainments. The progression of a feast was carefully orchestrated to create particular effects, starting with aperitifs to stimulate appetite, moving through multiple courses, each with their own wines or ales, including intervals for entertainment and dancing, and culminating in sweet wines and confections that might contain psychoactive spices. The entire event was designed to create a journey through different states of consciousness. The subtleties, elaborate constructions of sugar and spice presented between courses often contain psychoactive ingredients. These edible sculptures might be infused with rosewater, flavored with exotic spices, or include preparations designed to aid digestion or provide mild stimulation for continued feasting. The combination of visual spectacle and psychoactive ingredients made these presentations memorable highlights of medieval feasts. Medieval sexuality and psychoactive substances were connected in various ways. Beyond the love potions already mentioned, there were preparations believed to enhance sexual performance, increase fertility, or prevent conception. Some bathhouses were known for providing special preparations that enhanced sexual pleasure. The connection between intoxication and sex was recognized, and both celebrated and condemned depending on the context. Wine was associated with Venus and love, while certain herbs were believed to inflame or cool passion as needed. The treatment of what medieval medicine called excessive venery, too much sexual desire or activity, often involved psychoactive substances believed to cool the passions. Monks and nuns might use preparations of water lily, lettuce seed, or other cooling herbs to maintain their vows of celibacy. Conversely, married couples having difficulty conceiving might be prescribed warming, stimulating substances to increase their passion and fertility. The medieval garden was a carefully designed space that often included psychoactive plants alongside culinary and purely medicinal herbs. Monastery gardens, castle gardens, and even small household plots might include poppies for pain relief, hemp for fiber and medicine, henbane for its various uses, and numerous other plants with consciousness-altering properties. The arrangement of these gardens was often symbolic as well as practical, with plants grouped according to their planetary associations, their humoral qualities, or their medicinal uses. The knowledge of which plants to grow, when to harvest them, and how to preserve their potency was crucial. Many psychoactive plants needed to be harvested at specific times, before dawn, during particular phases of the moon, or on certain saints' days. The drying and preservation process could significantly affect potency. This knowledge was often closely guarded, passed down within families or professional guilds, and could make the difference between an effective remedy and a useless or dangerous preparation. Medieval children were not entirely sheltered from psychoactive substances. Weak ale was a common beverage for children, considered safer than water and more nutritious than many other options. Soothing syrups for teething or colic might contain opium or other sedatives. Children participated in festivals and celebrations, where adult intoxication was visible and sometimes emulated in play. The gradual initiation into adult drinking culture was part of growing up, with different expectations for different social classes and genders. The treatment of childhood ailments often involved substances that would concern us today. A restless child might be given preparations containing opium to ensure sleep. Remedies for worms, common in medieval children, might include psychoactive plants. The line between sedating a sick child for their own comfort and using substances to manage difficult behavior was not always clear. Some medieval childcare practices that seem shocking to us, like the use of opium-based soothing syrups, were motivated by genuine concern for children's well-being within the medical understanding of the time. The medieval attitude toward what we would now call mental illness was complex and often involved psychoactive substances, both as suspected causes and potential cures. Madness might be attributed to an imbalance of humors, possession by demons, or the influence of the moon. Treatments ranged from restraint and exorcism to the administration of various herbal preparations. Some of these treatments, like hellebore, were themselves powerfully psychoactive and could either cure or exacerbate the condition, depending on the dose and the individual's response. The famous Bethlehem Hospital in London, which would later become notorious as Bedlam, began as a medieval foundation for the care of the mentally ill. The treatments used there and in similar institutions across medieval Europe often involved psychoactive substances. Patients might be given sedatives to calm mania, stimulants to rouse those in states of melancholy, or purgatives believed to expel the harmful humors causing madness. The conditions in these early hospitals, combined with the powerful substances administered, must have created environments where the line between treatment and torment was thin indeed. The concept of sympathetic magic influenced how psychoactive substances were used in medieval times. The idea that like cures like, or that symbolic connections between objects could create real effects, shaped both the selection and preparation of consciousness-altering substances. A plant that resembled a particular organ might be used to treat that organ's diseases. Substances associated with particular saints or holy sites were believed to carry spiritual power that enhanced their physical effects. This magical thinking was not separate from medical practice, but interwoven with it in complex ways. The medieval trade routes that brought spices and silks from the East also carried knowledge about consciousness-altering practices from different cultures. The Silk Road was not just a conduit for goods, but for ideas, including ideas about how to use various substances to achieve different states of consciousness. Merchants, diplomats, and travelers brought back tales of the hashish eaters of Persia, the beetle chewers of India, the tea ceremonies of China. While not all of these substances were available in medieval Europe, the knowledge that different cultures had different relationships with consciousness alteration broadened the medieval understanding of what was possible. The medieval Islamic world's sophisticated approach to psychoactive substances particularly influenced European practices. Islamic physicians had developed complex classifications of drugs according to their effects, precise methods for preparing extracts and tinctures, and detailed observations of how different substances affected different types of people. This knowledge, transmitted through translations and through the practical experience of physicians who had studied in Islamic lands, enriched the European pharmacopoeia and provided new frameworks for understanding consciousness alteration. The Venetian trade networks deserve special attention for their role in distributing psychoactive substances. Throughout medieval Europe, Venice's merchant families didn't just trade in these substances. They also accumulated knowledge about their uses, preparation methods, and effects. The famous Venetian poisoners, who operated in the shadows of the city's glittering facade, were as much psychopharmacologists as assassins, understanding how to use substances to manipulate consciousness and behavior as well as to kill. The development of distillation technology in the medieval period revolutionized the production and use of psychoactive substances. While distillation was initially used primarily for creating medicines and perfumes, the technique was eventually applied to alcohol, creating spirits far more potent than anything available through fermentation alone. The aqua vita produced by medieval alchemists and physicians was both medicine and intoxicant, believed to preserve life while also capable of producing rapid and intense drunkenness. The medieval guild system played an important role in regulating and transmitting knowledge about psychoactive substances. Brewers' guilds controlled the production of ale and beer, maintaining standards and protecting trade secrets. Apothecaries' guilds oversaw the preparation and sale of medicinal substances, many of which were psychoactive. These guilds provided structure and accountability, though they also sometimes restricted innovation and maintained monopolies that kept certain substances expensive and rare. The intersection of psychoactive substances with medieval law presents interesting cases. While there were few laws specifically targeting drug use as we understand it, there were numerous regulations about brewing, selling ale, adulterating wine, and practicing medicine without proper authority. Court records from medieval towns show cases of brewers accused of adding harmful substances to their ales, wise women charged with providing dangerous potions, and physicians blamed for deaths caused by overdoses of powerful medicines. The concept of intention was crucial in how medieval law treated psychoactive substances. A substance given with intent to heal was treated differently from the same substance given with intent to harm, even if the outcome was the same. This focus on intention rather than outcome created gray areas where practitioners could operate, providing consciousness-altering substances for ambiguous purposes that might be medical, spiritual, or recreational depending on interpretation. Medieval literature provides windows into contemporary attitudes toward consciousness alteration. The romances speak of love potions and enchanted wines. The chronicles describe the drunken revels of kings and nobles. The morality plays warn against the dangers of excess. These literary representations both reflected and shaped social attitudes towards psychoactive substances. The figure of the drunk, whether comic or tragic, was a staple of medieval literature, representing both the pleasures and dangers of intentional consciousness alteration. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval religious visions deserves careful consideration. While many mystics achieved their visions through fasting, prayer, and contemplation alone, others may have had help from various substances. The bread eaten by religious communities might occasionally have been contaminated with ergot. The incense burned during lengthy vigils contained psychoactive compounds. The extreme fasting practiced by some mystics could produce its own alterations in consciousness that might be enhanced by even mild psychoactive substances. The medieval practice of bloodletting, while not directly related to psychoactive substances, could produce altered states of consciousness that were sometimes deliberately sought. The lightheadedness and euphoria that could follow blood loss were interpreted within the humoral framework as the release of excessive or corrupted humors. Some practitioners combined bloodletting with the administration of psychoactive substances, creating complex treatment protocols that must have produced profound alterations in consciousness. The seasonal availability of psychoactive substances shaped their use in medieval society. Fresh plants were available only during certain months, though dried preparations could be stored. The wine harvest brought temporary abundance and often excessive consumption. The brewing season was limited by temperature and the availability of grain. This seasonality created rhythms of intoxication and sobriety, abundance and scarcity that shaped social life and cultural practices. The medieval understanding of tolerance and what we would now call addiction was limited, but not absent. Observers noted that habitual drinkers needed more wine to achieve the same effects, that some people seemed unable to stop using certain substances despite harmful consequences, and that sudden cessation of habitual use could cause illness. These observations led to various theories and treatments, though without the biochemical understanding that underlies modern addiction medicine. The role of set and setting, the psychological and environmental factors that shaped drug experiences, was intuitively understood by medieval practitioners, even if not explicitly theorized. A substance taken in a sacred space during religious ritual would be expected to produce different effects than the same substance taken in a tavern. The presence of music, incense, ritual objects, and communal expectation all shaped how consciousness-altering substances were experienced. Medieval death practices often involved psychoactive substances. The dying might receive opium or other sedatives to ease their passing. The washing and preparation of bodies sometimes involved aromatic herbs that had mild psychoactive properties. Funeral feasts included substantial drinking that helped mourners process their grief. The commemoration of the dead through anniversary masses and feasts created regular occasions for consciousness alteration in memory of the departed. The medieval practice of embalming, reserved for the wealthy and powerful, used various substances that could affect those preparing the bodies. The combination of aromatics, preservatives, and the enclosed spaces where this work was done could produce altered states in the embalmers. This may have contributed to the somewhat mystical status of those who prepared the dead, seen as operating at the boundary between life and death. The use of psychoactive substances in medieval craft production is often overlooked. Dyers used urine that had been altered by consuming certain plants to fix colors. Tanners employed various fermented substances that produced powerful fumes. Smiths working with certain metals were exposed to vapors that could affect consciousness. These occupational exposures created unintentional but sometimes significant alterations in consciousness among medieval workers. The medieval fair and market were sites of experimentation and exchange of psychoactive substances. Traveling merchants brought exotic preparations from distant lands. Local wise women sold their herbal remedies. Entertainers and performers might offer unusual substances as part of their acts. These gatherings were opportunities for people to encounter new forms of consciousness alteration, though also risks for poisoning or deception. The regulation of bread and brewing in medieval towns was motivated partly by concerns about psychoactive contamination. Ergot-infected grain could cause mass poisoning. Unscrupulous brewers might add psychoactive plants to make their ale seem stronger. Bakers might use spoiled grain that could cause unexpected effects. Town authorities employed ale tasters and bread weighers, not just to ensure fair measure, but to protect against dangerous adulterants. Medieval sexuality and consciousness alteration intersected in complex ways beyond simple aphrodisiacs. Some religious communities use psychoactive substances to suppress sexual desire. Prostitutes might use substances to endure their work or to manipulate clients. Married couples employed various preparations to enhance fertility or prevent conception. The bathhouse culture of medieval Europe often combined consciousness alteration with sexual activity in ways that scandalized religious authorities. The medieval understanding of contagion and disease influenced how psychoactive substances were used during epidemics. During plague outbreaks, people consumed preparations believed to protect against infection, some of which contained psychoactive ingredients. The terror of epidemic disease led to increased drinking and the use of substances to manage anxiety. Physicians treating plague victims often used powerful sedatives, both to ease suffering and to prevent patients from spreading the disease through their agitation. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval education extended beyond student drinking culture. Some scholars believed certain substances could enhance memory or understanding. Students might use stimulants to stay awake for late-night study or sedatives to calm examination nerves. The transmission of knowledge about these substances was itself part of education, with medical students learning to identify, prepare, and administer various psychoactive medicines. Medieval diplomatic practices sometimes involved the strategic use of psychoactive substances. Negotiators might ply their counterparts with strong wine to gain advantage. Gifts between rulers might include exotic psychoactive preparations. The ceremonial sharing of food and drink that accompanied diplomatic meetings created opportunities for both building trust and potential manipulation through consciousness alteration. The medieval tournament and its associated festivities were occasions for elaborate consciousness alteration. Knights might use substances to steady their nerves before jousting. Spectators consumed large quantities of ale and wine. Victory celebrations could involve days of drinking and feasting. The dangerous nature of tournament combat, combined with the consciousness-altering substances consumed, created an atmosphere of heightened excitement and potential tragedy. The development of medieval hospitals and infirmaries led to more systematic use of psychoactive substances in medical care. These institutions developed standardized preparations and dosing regimens. They kept gardens specifically for medicinal plants, including many with psychoactive properties. The concentration of medical knowledge in these institutions led to both advances in understanding and occasional disasters when powerful substances were misused. Medieval concepts of age and authority influenced who could use certain psychoactive substances. Children were generally given weaker preparations, though practices varied by social class and region. Elderly people might receive stronger medicines based on beliefs about their constitutional strength. Women's access to certain substances was sometimes restricted based on beliefs about female physiology and temperament. These age and gender restrictions created different relationships with consciousness alteration across medieval society. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval magic and divination practices was significant, if often hidden. Fortune tellers might use substances to enhance their perceived powers or to produce effects in their clients. Practitioners of love magic employed preparations that could alter mood and perception. The blurry line between legitimate medicine and illicit magic meant that many psychoactive substances occupied an ambiguous legal and social position. The medieval response to what we would recognize as drug-related crime was complex and inconsistent. Poisoning was severely punished, but the sale of dangerous substances was often tolerated if framed as medicine. Theft committed while intoxicated might be punished differently than sober theft, depending on local customs and circumstances. The production and sale of consciousness-altering substances created economic networks that sometimes operated outside the law. The influence of classical texts on medieval understanding of psychoactive substances cannot be overstated. Works by Dioscorides, Galen, and other ancient authorities were copied, translated, and commented upon throughout the medieval period. These texts provided both practical information about specific substances and theoretical frameworks for understanding their effects. Medieval scholars attempted to reconcile classical knowledge with Christian theology and contemporary observations, creating complex hybrid theories. The medieval Jewish community's approach to psychoactive substances reflected both their own traditions and their position as intermediaries between Christian and Islamic cultures. Jewish physicians often had access to texts and knowledge from both worlds. Religious law governing the use of wine and other substances created particular practices around consciousness alteration. The Jewish role in medieval medicine meant they were often at the forefront of understanding and using psychoactive substances therapeutically. Medieval veterinary medicine also employed psychoactive substances. Horses might be given preparations to calm them for shoeing or medical treatment. Dogs used for hunting might receive stimulants to increase their eagerness. Farm animals were sometimes sedated for castration or other procedures. The observation of how animals responded to various substances contributed to medieval understanding of psychopharmacology. The economics of tavern keeping in medieval times created incentives for various forms of consciousness alteration. Tavern keepers wanted customers to drink more, but not become so intoxicated that they caused trouble. This led to the development of techniques for managing intoxication, food served at particular times, drinks of varying strengths, substances added to ale to increase or decrease its effects. The successful tavern keeper was partly a social engineer, creating environments conducive to profitable but manageable consciousness alteration. The medieval practice of food preservation often involved fermentation processes that could produce psychoactive effects. Fermented fish, pickled vegetables, and preserved meats might develop compounds that affect consciousness. The limited diet of winter months, heavily dependent on preserved foods, might have created seasonal patterns of mild consciousness alteration from dietary sources alone. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval slavery and servitude deserves attention. Slaves might be given substances to make them more compliant or to enable them to endure harsh labor. The controlled provision of alcohol to workers was sometimes used as a management tool. The denial of access to consciousness-altering substances could be used as punishment. These practices reveal the dark side of medieval consciousness alteration as a tool of social control. Medieval beliefs about the properties of different waters influenced consciousness alteration practices. Certain springs were believed to have healing or visionary properties. Water used for brewing was carefully selected for its qualities. The dilution of wine with different waters was thought to produce different effects. These beliefs led to pilgrimage to specific water sources and trade in waters from famous springs. The medieval understanding of music's power to alter consciousness often involved beliefs about sympathy and resonance that connected to psychoactive substance use. Certain musical modes were believed to enhance or counteract the effects of various substances. Musicians might use substances to achieve the proper state for performance. The combination of music and consciousness-altering substances in ritual contexts was understood to be particularly powerful. The practice of medieval forestry included knowledge about psychoactive trees and plants. Forest workers knew which mushrooms could produce visions, which tree barks could be used for medicine, which berries could intoxicate, This knowledge was often kept secret, as forest resources were valuable and sometimes legally protected. The folklore of the forest, with its mysterious beings and enchanted groves, partly reflected the reality of psychoactive substances found in woodland settings. Medieval attitudes towards suicide and self-harm influenced the use of psychoactive substances. The Church's condemnation of suicide as a mortal sin meant that those contemplating self-harm might use substances to achieve oblivion without directly taking their own lives. Conversely, substances might be used to prevent suicide by treating the melancholy believed to cause it. The management of suicidal ideation through psychoactive substances represented an early form of psychiatric medication. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval pregnancy and childbirth was complex and sometimes controversial. Midwives used various preparations to ease labor pains, but some authorities worried these might harm the child or interfere with the natural process. Substances to prevent miscarriage or induce abortion were known but often illegal. The management of pregnancy-related mood changes might involve mild psychoactive preparations. These practices reveal medieval understanding of the relationship between maternal consumption and fetal health. The medieval cult of saints created associations between particular holy figures and specific consciousness-altering substances or practices. Saint Anthony was invoked against ergotism, Saint Vitus against dancing mania, Saint Valentine against epilepsy and madness. Pilgrims might use substances associated with particular saints as part of their devotional practices. The miraculous cures attributed to saints sometimes involved the discreet use of psychoactive medicines by those managing shrines. Medieval maritime culture had unique relationships with consciousness-altering substances. The isolation and danger of sea travel created needs for both stimulation and sedation. Sailors developed traditions around drinking that helped maintain morale during long voyages. The encounter with foreign ports exposed sailors to new substances and practices. The maritime spread of psychoactive knowledge and substances was a crucial vector for cultural exchange. The development of medieval universities created new contexts for both the study and use of psychoactive substances. Medical faculties investigated the properties of various substances, sometimes through self-experimentation. Student culture celebrated excessive drinking through songs and rituals. The concentration of young men with money and freedom in university towns created markets for various forms of consciousness alteration. The tension between the intellectual study of substances and their recreational use played out in university communities. Medieval concepts of honor and reputation influenced how consciousness alteration was perceived. The ability to drink heavily without losing control was seen as a sign of strength and nobility. Conversely, being known as someone who couldn't hold their drink could damage social standing. The use of other psychoactive substances might be acceptable if done correctly, but shameful if it led to public disgrace. These social pressures shaped patterns of use and the development of rituals around consciousness alteration. The medieval practice of dream interpretation created demand for substances that could influence dreaming. Professional dream interpreters might provide preparations to clients seeking prophetic dreams. The recording and analysis of dreams, particularly those experienced under the influence of various substances, contributed to medieval understanding of consciousness. The boundary between natural and supernatural explanations for dreams was permeable, with psychoactive substances occupying an ambiguous position. Medieval astronomy and astrology influenced the timing and manner of psychoactive substance use. Planetary hours were believed to affect the potency and effects of various preparations. The moon's phases guided the harvesting and preparation of psychoactive plants. Astrological calculations might determine the best time for taking particular medicines. This integration of celestial observation with practical pharmacology created complex systems for optimizing consciousness alteration. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval rebellion and social unrest is difficult to document, but certainly significant. Peasant uprisings often began in taverns where alcohol loosened tongues and inflamed grievances. Authorities worried about the use of substances to coordinate resistance or inspire courage in rebels. The suppression of certain gathering places or practices was sometimes motivated by fears about consciousness alteration leading to political action. Medieval beliefs about the four humors created elaborate frameworks for understanding and predicting psychoactive effects. A person's humoral constitution was thought to determine how they would respond to various substances. Treatments aimed to restore humoral balance might involve complex regimens of different psychoactive substances taken in specific sequences. This personalized approach to consciousness alteration, while based on incorrect theory, sometimes led to careful observation of individual responses to substances. The medieval practice of confession created unique windows into consciousness alteration practices. Penitents might confess to using forbidden substances or to acts committed while intoxicated. Confessors needed to understand various states of consciousness to properly assign penance. The seal of confession protected information about illicit substance use, creating a space where practices could be discussed without legal consequence. Penitential manuals provided guidance on how to handle various substance-related sins. Medieval concepts of possession and exorcism often involved psychoactive substances, either as causes or cures. Possession might be attributed to the consumption of contaminated food or cursed potions. Exorcism rituals might employ fumigations with psychoactive smoke or the administration of purgative substances. The dramatic behaviors associated with possession and exorcism might sometimes have been influenced by consciousness-altering substances, whether deliberately administered or accidentally consumed. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval agriculture went beyond the accidental consumption of ergot. Farmers knew which plants could be used to protect crops from pests, some of which had psychoactive properties. The fermentation of various agricultural products created opportunities for consciousness alteration. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work were punctuated by festivals involving substantial consumption of alcohol and possibly other substances. Medieval beliefs about transformation and metamorphosis often involved psychoactive substances. Stories of humans becoming animals, whether through curses or voluntary shape-shifting, might reflect experiences with powerful hallucinogens. These connections reveal how consciousness alteration was integrated into cultural production. The practice of medieval hunting often involved consciousness-altering substances. Hunters might use preparations to sharpen their senses or increase endurance. The celebration after successful hunts invariably involved drinking and feasting. Hunting accidents under the influence were common enough to be noted in chronicles. The dangerous nature of hunting while intoxicated added to its appeal for those seeking excitement. Medieval understanding of dreams and visions was deeply influenced by experiences with psychoactive substances. The boundary between natural dreams, divinely inspired visions, and drug-induced hallucinations was not clearly drawn. Dream interpretation manuals might include information about how different substances affected dream content. The cultivation of prophetic dreams through consciousness alteration was a recognized if controversial practice. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval diplomacy and espionage included practices we might recognize as truth serums. Certain preparations were believed to compel honesty or lower inhibitions in ways useful for extracting information. Spies might use substances to maintain cover identities or to endure torture. The game of diplomatic intelligence included consciousness alteration as both tool and vulnerability. Medieval concepts of charisma and leadership were influenced by the ability to manage consciousness alteration. A leader who could drink heavily while maintaining composure gained respect. The strategic use of substances in political contexts required skill and judgment. The sharing of rare or powerful substances could create political bonds. These practices reveal how power and consciousness alteration were connected in medieval politics. The development of medieval music theory and practice involved consciousness-altering substances in various ways. Musicians might use substances to enhance creativity or performance. The mathematical relationships in music were sometimes explored through altered states. The power of music to affect consciousness was understood to be enhanced by certain substances. These connections contributed to medieval understanding of harmony and resonance. Medieval attitudes toward work and labor were influenced by consciousness-altering practices. The use of ale as a dietary staple for workers has been mentioned, but beyond this, different trades had different relationships with substances. Some work required sobriety. Other tasks were traditionally performed while mildly intoxicated. The rhythm of work and rest often involved consciousness alteration as transition. These patterns reveal how labor and consciousness alteration were integrated in medieval life. The practice of medieval scholarship sometimes involved consciousness-altering substances beyond the stereotypical drinking of students. Scholars might use substances to maintain focus during long copying sessions, or to enhance memory while studying. The pursuit of knowledge through altered states was controversial but practiced. The tension between intellectual rigor and consciousness alteration created debates that continue today. Medieval concepts of hospitality were intimately connected with consciousness alteration. The obligation to provide food and drink to guests included providing consciousess-altering substances, refusing offered drinks could be a serious insult. The quality and quantity of substances offered reflected on the host's honor. These customs created complex social dynamics around consciousness alteration that went far beyond simple consumption. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval concepts of inspiration and creativity deserves special attention. Poets might seek inspiration through wine or other substances. Artists might use preparations to enhance visual perception. The divine madness of creativity was sometimes deliberately cultivated through consciousness alteration. These practices challenge modern assumptions about the relationship between substances and genuine creativity. Medieval understanding of what we would now call psychosomatic illness often involved psychoactive substances. Conditions with no clear physical cause might be treated with consciousness-altering preparations. The power of belief in healing was recognized and sometimes enhanced through mild consciousness alteration. The placebo effect, while not named as such, was observed and utilized. These practices reveal sophisticated, if not scientifically accurate understanding of mind-body connections. The practice of medieval cartography and exploration sometimes involved consciousness-altering substances. Navigators might use stimulants during long voyages. The interpretation of new lands and peoples might be influenced by altered states. Some explorers reported using local psychoactive substances to better understand foreign cultures. These practices influenced how medieval people understood and represented the wider world. Medieval concepts of property and ownership were complicated by consciousness alteration. Contracts made while intoxicated might be challenged. The theft of psychoactive substances was treated differently from other thefts. The ownership of recipes for powerful preparations was legally protected. These legal complexities reveal how consciousness alteration intersected with property rights. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval concepts of love and romance extended beyond simple aphrodisiacs. The experience of falling in love was sometimes compared to intoxication. Substances might be used to manage the pain of unrequited love or to celebrate union. The poetry of courtly love often uses consciousness alteration as metaphor and reality. These connections reveal how emotion and consciousness alteration were understood as related experiences. Medieval understanding of habit and routine incorporated consciousness alteration in daily patterns that seem foreign to us now. The punctuation of daily life with mild consciousness alteration through ale, wine, or other substances created rhythms of awareness that shaped experience. The marking of transitions from work to rest, from sacred to profane time, often involved consciousness-altering substances. These patterns reveal how different the texture of daily consciousness was in medieval times. The practice of medieval fishing and maritime food gathering sometimes involved consciousness-altering substances. Fishermen might use preparations to stay alert during night fishing or to endure cold conditions. The preservation of fish often involved fermentation that could produce psychoactive compounds. The dangerous nature of maritime work created needs for both stimulation and sedation that were met through various substances. Medieval concepts of luck and fortune were influenced by consciousness-altering practices. Gamblers might use substances believed to improve luck or judgment. The interpretation of omens might be enhanced through altered states. The acceptance of fortune's changes might be eased through consciousness alteration. These practices reveal how uncertainty was managed in medieval life. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval concepts of honor and shame created complex social dynamics. Public intoxication might be shameful or honorable, depending on context. The ability to provide rare substances brought honor. The misuse of substances could bring lasting shame. These social pressures shaped consumption patterns and created elaborate rituals around consciousness alteration. Medieval understanding of resemblance and sympathy influenced how psychoactive substances were identified and used. Plants that resembled body parts were used to treat those parts. Substances from certain animals were believed to confer that animal's qualities. These beliefs created a rich symbolic system for understanding consciousness, alteration that went beyond simple cause and effect. The practice of medieval brewing and fermentation was both art and science, involving deep knowledge of how to create and control consciousness-altering substances. Brewers understood the importance of temperature, timing, and ingredients in creating desired effects. The guild secrets of master brewers included knowledge about psychoactive additives. The social position of brewers reflected their role as providers of consciousness alteration. Medieval concepts of privacy and publicity were influenced by consciousness-altering practices. Some substances were consumed privately, others required public witness. The revelation of secrets under the influence was both feared and exploited. The management of public and private consciousness was a social skill. These dynamics reveal how consciousness alteration was integrated into social life. The role of psychoactive substances in medieval concepts of masculinity.